The silence of the iron grave was never truly silent. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse, the groan of cooling metal, the hiss of the oxygen scrubbers, and the distant, lonely howl of the electromagnetic storms scouring the moon's surface. I had lived in Sector 4B for 3 long years, and in all that time the machine was the only thing that spoke to me. It didn't lie, and it didn't vote to ruin a man's life. I was checking the perimeter sensors near the primary airlock when I smelled it. It wasn't the usual scent of ozone and recycled grease. It was something organic, something raw. It smelled of unwashed skin and the metallic tang of old blood. I crouched by the intake manifold, my fingers tracing the jagged edge of a thermal vent that had been pried open with more force than a tool should allow. The heavy grating was bent outward like a piece of tin foil. I reached for the mag light on my belt, clicking it on. The beam sliced through the darkness of the shaft, illuminating a trail of small, frantic footprints in the dust of the service tunnel. "Those aren't scavenger prints," I muttered to the empty corridor. I didn't make a habit of talking to myself, but on a moon where the nearest human was 10,000 kilometers away in a luxury spire, the sound of a voice, even my own, kept the madness at bay. The tracks were too narrow for a grown man and too heavy for a rodent. They led deep into the sublevels, toward the auxiliary cooling core. I followed them, my heavy boots clanking against the rusted floor plates. I had chosen this place because it was a graveyard for a dead corporation, a place where no one would ever look for a disgraced engineer from a Lindos city. If something was alive down here, it was a threat to my solitude. I found the intruder in a cramped alcove behind the primary coolant tank. It was a child. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, though it was hard to tell with his kind. His skin was the color of a bruised twilight, a dull gray purple that marked him as a shade, a bioengineered asset meant for high-pressure labor. He was shivering, his ribs visible through a torn synthetic tunic, and his hands were stained with the black oil of the machines. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. The child's eyes snapped open. They were wide, luminescent orbs of amber green, typical of the Gamma series hybrids. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for help. Instead, he let out a low, vibrating snarl that sounded more like a malfunctioning motor than a human throat. "Easy there, kid. I'm not with the security teams." "I'm just a gearhead," I said, raising my hands to show they were empty. The child lunged. It was a blur of gray limbs and teeth. I hissed in pain as his small, sharp fangs sank through my flight suit and bit deep into the meat of my forearm. I didn't strike him. I simply pulled back, dragging him an inch forward before he let go, and scrambled back into the darkness of the alcove, his small fists clenched. "So, that's how we're playing it," I whispered, clutching my bleeding arm. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But you're shorted if you think biting the only guy with a functioning stove is a good tactical move." I sat down on the cold floor, 3 meters away from the vent entrance. The temperature in the sublevels was dropping as the moon rotated away from its dying star. I could hear the child's teeth chattering, a frantic clicking sound against the hum of the coolant pumps. "You ate my emergency rations, didn't you?" I asked conversationally. "The nutrient packs in the storage locker. It took me 6 months to trade for those with the orbital scavengers." The child said nothing. He just stared, his amber eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting of the corridor. "And you stack the empty foils," I noted. "Neatly, in the corner. That's a strange habit for a feral. Most scavengers just leave a mess. You're organized. I like that." I reached into my pack and pulled out a fresh nutrient bar, high protein, flavored like nothing but survival. I unwrapped it slowly, making sure he could hear the crinkle of the foil. I set it on a clean patch of floor halfway between us and backed away. "I'm leaving this here," I told him. "When I'm gone, you eat. Tomorrow I'll come back with more. That's the deal. No traps, no cortex links, just food." I walked back to my living quarters, my arm throbbing. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a strange, inconvenient weight in my chest. It wasn't the heavy gravity of the moon. It was the sudden, sharp awareness that something else on this rock needed me to keep the air scrubbers running. That night, the iron grave felt smaller. I sat at my workbench, staring at the blueprints of a ship I would never build, and wondered how a shade child had ended up on a dead moon. Shades were property. They were manufactured in the vats of Ethelgard and shipped to the core worlds for heavy labor. They didn't just wander into the rim territories. Someone had lost a very expensive asset, or someone had thrown a child into the void to die. Both possibilities meant trouble was coming, and trouble was the one thing I couldn't afford. I looked at the bite mark on my arm. It was small, but the intent behind it had been absolute. "I'm calling you Ares," I muttered to the darkness. It was a name from an old book I'd found in the ruins of the library, a name for someone who belonged to the stars. The wind outside screamed against the hull, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a funeral song. It felt like a warning. The second morning on the iron grave arrived with a flare of radiation that turned the horizon a sickly shade of neon orange. I woke before the internal clocks chirped, my body still tuned to the survival rhythms of the orbital docks. Stove first, water second, coffee third. The coffee was synthetic, bitter, and tasted like charcoal, but it was the only thing that made my brain feel like it was properly slotted into its socket. I sat in my single chair, looking out the reinforced porthole at the jagged mountains of scrap metal that littered the landscape. The station was a tomb, but I had made it a functional one. One bed, one table, one set of tools. I didn't need a second of anything. Relationships were high-maintenance systems that inevitably crashed, leaving you with nothing but corrupted data and a hole in your heart. I packed a small bag with 2 nutrient bars, a thermal blanket, and a bottle of filtered water. I hiked back down to the cooling core, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the hollow ribs of the station. When I reached the alcove, the nutrient bar I had left was gone. In its place, the child had left a small, intricate shape made from discarded copper wiring. It was a crude representation of a gear, perfectly symmetrical. "Payment?" I asked, looking toward the dark opening of the vent. Movement. A pair of amber-green eyes appeared at the edge of the light. The child didn't snarl this time, but his body was coiled like a high-tension spring. "Food is trap," the boy whispered. His voice was a shock, cracked, dry, and laden with a heavy accent I recognized from the lower industrial sectors of Olindos. It was the voice of a child who had been taught that every hand offered to him held a leash. "It's not a trap, Aris," I said. "Who is Aris?" the child asked, tilting his head. "You are, until you tell me a better name." "I am Asset Gamma 904, he said, his voice flat and robotic. "That's a serial number, not a name," I countered. "I don't talk to serial numbers. I talk to people. Are you a person?" The boy hesitated. His fingers gripped the edge of the metal vent, his knuckles white. "Men take Gamma 904. Put him in the dark box. Give him the needle." The cold anger that I had tried to bury 3 years ago flared up in my gut. I knew about the dark boxes. I knew about the needles used to recalibrate the biohybrids when they showed too much personality. "I'm not those men," I said, setting the thermal blanket and the food down. "Look at this place. Does it look like a corporate facility? It's a junk pile. I'm just a scavenger. I don't want to recalibrate anything. I just want you to stop starving in my vents." Eris didn't move for a long time. He watched me with a calculation that was far beyond his years. He was measuring the gap between my words and my intent, looking for the hidden hook in the bait. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why give food?" "Because I remember what it feels like to be a problem that needs to be deleted," I said. "And because I'm tired of being the only thing alive on this moon." I backed away, giving him space. This time he didn't wait for me to leave. He darted out of the vent, snatched the blanket, and retreated back into the shadows in a single fluid motion. But he didn't disappear. He sat just inside the darkness, wrapping the wool around his thin shoulders. "The air is thin today," I noted. "The scrubbers are struggling in Sector 7. You should come to the upper decks. The air is better there." "Trap," he repeated, though the snarl was gone. "Fine. Stay in the dark and breathe rust. I'll be at the workbench if you change your mind." I spent the next 4 hours repairing a damaged power cell. It was tedious work, requiring a steady hand and a focused mind. I became so absorbed in the flow of the electrons that I didn't hear him enter. He was standing 10 paces away, a ghost in a wool blanket. He was barefoot, his feet calloused and stained with the black dust of the moon. He didn't say a word, He just watched my hands move over the circuit board. This is a power cell, I said, not looking up. It's what keeps the lights on. Power, Eris whispered. Exactly. Everything needs power. Even you. That's what the food is for. It's your fuel. He took a step closer. His eyes were fixed on the soldering iron, fascinated by the blue glow of the plasma. I have boots, I said. They're too big for you, but we can stuff the toes with rags. Frostbite is a one-way trip, kid. You lose a toe, it doesn't grow back. Why do you care about my toes? He asked, his voice small. Because I'm an engineer, I said, finally looking at him. I hate seeing things that are broken when they could be fixed. It's an occupational hazard. He considered this for a long minute. Then he took 3 more steps. He was now within arm's reach. I could see the ash on his face, the way his hair was matted with grease. He looked like a scrap heap version of a human, but the light in his eyes was brighter than any star in the sky. Teach me, he said. What? Teach me to fix, he said, pointing at the power cell. I felt a ghost of a smile tug at the corner of my mouth, a sensation so foreign it almost hurt. All right, Eris, grab that stool. But if you touch the plasma lead, you're going to learn a very painful lesson about conductivity. We worked in silence for the rest of the day. I showed him how to identify a blown fuse and how to strip a wire without snapping the core. He was a natural. His movements were precise, his focus absolute. He didn't have the clumsy uncertainty of a human child. He had the built-in dexterity of a creature designed to work. By dusk, the power cell was humming with a steady, healthy green light. Good job, I said, leaning back. Eris looked at the cell, then at his own hands. For the first time, his expression wasn't one of fear or calculation. It was wonder. I fixed it, he whispered. Yeah, you did. He didn't return to the vents that night. He dragged the thermal blanket into the corner of the workshop and curled up on a pile of clean rags. I didn't offer him the bed. I knew better than to push him too fast. I stayed at my desk, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The iron grave was still a tomb, and I was still a dead man walking. But as I listened to the quiet breathing of the boy in the corner, the silence of the moon didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. But the peace was short-lived. At exactly midnight, the station's proximity alarm screamed into life. It wasn't the erratic chirping of a meteor shower or the low drone of a cargo drone. It was a high-priority breach alert. Unauthorized entry, the computer's cold voice echoed through the workshop. Airlock primary. Forced bypass detected. Eris was on his feet in a second, his teeth bared, his amber eyes glowing in the dark. They found me, he hissed. The men with the needles. I grabbed my heavy-duty welding torch and a kinetic pistol from the locker. Stay behind me, I ordered. I moved toward the main corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had spent 3 years ensuring no one could find this place. If the corporation was here, I was as good as vented. I reached the airlock just as the inner door hissed open. I leveled my pistol at the opening, my finger on the trigger. Freeze, I shouted. 3 figures stood in the midst of the decompressing airlock. They weren't armored security guards or corporate cleanup crews. They were women, shades like Eris. The one in the lead was tall, her hair braided with industrial wire, a jagged bone-handled knife held in a grip that suggested she knew exactly how to use it. Her flight suit was scorched, and she was breathing in ragged, desperate gas. Where is he? She demanded, her voice a low growl that shook the very air in the corridor. Where is my son? I didn't lower the gun. You're late, I said, my voice as cold as the vacuum outside. And you've got 10 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't vent this entire sector before you take another step. The woman didn't flinch. She stepped forward, the light hitting the fierce, terrified hunger in her eyes. My name is Kyra, she said, and if you've heard him, there isn't a hole in this galaxy deep enough to hide you from me. Behind her, an older woman with milky white eyes reached out to touch the wall, her fingers moving with a strange, rhythmic grace. And a younger girl, her left arm held in a makeshift sling of blood-stained mesh, leaned heavily against the frame. The iron grave was no longer a tomb. It was a battlefield. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and something much sharper, the ozone sting of a charging kinetic pistol. My finger was locked on the trigger, The muscle memory of a man who had survived the Alindo City purges, screaming at me to shoot first and ask questions once the floor was painted red. Kira didn't move. She stood framed by the flickering emergency lights of the airlock, her bone-handled knife held low, her eyes burning with a primal, terrifying clarity. She looked like a ghost that had clawed its way out of an industrial shredder, her flight suit stained with the dark, oily grime of the deep space docks. "Drop the iron, scrapper," she snarled. The slang hit me like a physical blow. Scrapper. It was what the core world citizens called the dregs who picked through the remains of dead stars. It was a word meant to diminish, but coming from her, it sounded like a death sentence. "You first," I countered, my voice echoing through the hollow ribs of the station. "You're the ones who bypassed my security. You're the ones standing in my home with a shank. I didn't steal your kid, Kiri. I found him starving in a vent. I've been feeding him my own rations while you were busy playing hide-and-seek with the corporate scouts." The mention of Eris made her flinch. Her gaze flickered past me, searching the shadows of the workshop. "Eris," she called out, her voice cracking for the briefest of seconds, losing its jagged edge. "Baby, are you there?" The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the air scrubbers. Then, a small shadow detached itself from the rags in the corner of the workshop. Eris walked forward, the thermal blanket draped over his shoulders like a tattered royal cape. He didn't run to her. He stopped 3 meters behind me, his amber eyes shifting between my kinetic pistol and the mother he hadn't seen in days. "Mama," he whispered. The knife in Kira's hand trembled. The fierce warrior stance collapsed as she sank to her knees, her hands reaching out into the empty air. Eris took a hesitant step, then another, before finally breaking into a run. He collided with her, burying his face in the scorched fabric of her tunic. The sound she made then wasn't human. It was a low, keening wail of relief that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the sound of a system finally finding its missing component. I didn't lower the gun, not yet. There were still 2 other shades in the airlock, and in the iron grave, you didn't survive by being a welcoming host. The older woman stepped out of the mist. She moved with a slow, deliberate caution, her milky eyes staring at a point exactly 3 inches above my head. She didn't need sight to navigate. I could see the way her ears twitched, tracking the subtle echoes of the room. She was a Sola Series elder, an antique model that Ethelgard had stopped manufacturing 40 years ago because they were too perceptive, too difficult to control. "Lower the weapon, Kaelin Vesper," she said. Her voice was like dry parchment rubbing against stone. My heart skipped a beat. "How do you know my name?" "You carry it like a heavy pack," she replied, "and the air around you doesn't smell of malice. It smells of loneliness and cold coffee. A man who intends to kill doesn't breathe in such a steady, tired rhythm." She reached out and touched the wall, her fingers tracing the rusted rivets of the bulkhead. "This station is a graveyard, yet the heart of it still beats. You have kept it alive. You have kept the boy alive. For that, the dead is acknowledged." The third girl, the one with the shattered arm, slumped against the frame of the airlock. She was younger than Kira, maybe 20 or 21. Her skin was a pale, sickly gray, and the sweat on her brow shimmered in the dim light. The mesh sling around her arm was soaked through with a fluid that was too dark to be simple blood. It was hydraulic fluid mixed with biomatter. "She's flatlining," I muttered, finally clicking the safety on my pistol and holstering it. "If you don't get her to the med bench, she's going to lose that limb, and probably the rest of herself along with it." Kira looked up from her son, her face a mask of exhausted fury. "We don't have credits for a med bay, and we don't trust corporate docs. You're not in Alindos, Kira. There are no docs here, just me and a bunch of salvage tech that's probably older than you are." I stepped back, gesturing toward the workshop. "Bring her in, and close that damn airlock. Every second it's open, we're leaking heat we can't afford to lose." Kira hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes searching mine for the hidden hook, the corporate trap she had been running from her entire life. Then she nodded to the older woman. They scooped the girl up, carrying her into the warmth of the workshop. The iron grave had gone from a solitary confinement cell to a refugee camp in the span of 10 minutes. I walked over to the primary control console and punched in a sequence to seal the sector. The heavy blast doors groaned as they slid into place, the sound of the locks engaging echoing like a finality. I looked at the four of them, a mother clinging to a child, a blind elder who could see my soul, and a dying girl with a mechanical arm that was leaking the very essence of her life onto my floor. 5 souls on a dead moon, I whispered to the shadows. This is going to be a hell of a long winter. I moved to the med bench, clearing away a pile of half-disassembled servos. Get her on the table, I ordered, my engineer brain taking over. Kira, I need you to hold the light. Sola, if you can find the water filtration unit in the corner, start a cycle. We're going to need clean fluid. What are you doing? Kira asked, her voice sharp with suspicion, as she watched me reach for a surgical laser and a set of precision wrenches. I'm fixing a machine, I said, looking her dead in the eye. And on this station, everyone is a machine until the sun comes up. Now hold the damn light steady. The girl on the table let out a low, ragged moan. Her name was Zane, and as I cut away the blood-soaked fabric of her sleeve, I realized that the broken arm was an understatement. The Ethelgard engineers had rigged her with a prototype Cortex-Link augmentation, a heavy industrial-grade limb that had been grafted directly into her nervous system. The graft was rejecting. The biological tissue was screaming in agony, while the mechanical components were trying to draw power from a body that had nothing left to give. It was a mess of steel and sinew, a perfect metaphor for everything that was wrong with the galaxy. And for the next 4 hours, it was the only thing that mattered. The workshop smelled of burnt hair and sterilized metal. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of the surgical laser and the frantic, shallow breathing of Zane as she drifted in and out of consciousness. I was elbow-deep in the internal wiring of her arm, my fingers moving with a precision that I hadn't used since the days I was designing orbital platforms for the Nexara group. This isn't a standard graft, I muttered, sweat stinging my eyes. Kira was standing over me, the heavy industrial light held with a military discipline that didn't waver for a second. This is a mess. They used a low-grade bridge to connect the neural pathways. It's like trying to run a fusion reactor through a copper wire. It was always going to fry her. Can you fix it? Kira asked. Her voice was low, but I could hear the tremor of fear underneath the steel. If she loses the arm, she won't be able to work. If she can't work, the camps won't take her. I glanced up at her, the blue glow of the laser reflecting in my goggles. In the camps, is that all a person is? A set of functioning limbs? Kira's jaw tightened. In the camps, you're either an asset or a liability. There is no third option for a shade. I looked back down at the open wound, at the delicate intersection where the silver neural filaments met the purple-gray flesh of her shoulder. I'm not fixing her so she can go back to a camp, I said, my voice raspy from the dry air. I'm fixing her because I hate bad engineering. I reached for a pair of microforceps, carefully peeling back a layer of necrotic tissue. The slang of the orbital docs came back to me, the words we used when a system was on the verge of a total collapse. She's frazzled, Kira. The feedback loop is dumping static directly into her prefrontal cortex. If I don't bypass the bridge, she's going to go brain dead before I can even seal the bleeders. Do it, a voice said from the corner. It was Sola. She was sitting on a crate, her sightless eyes turned toward the ceiling, her hands folded in her lap. The static she feels is the same static we all feel. The noise of a world that wants us to be silent. Clear the channel, Kalen. Let her hear her own heart again. I didn't argue. I worked. I bypassed the faulty cortex bridge, rerouting the neural impulses through a secondary sensory weave I had salvaged from a scout drone 6 months ago. It was a jury-rigged solution, the kind of thing that would have gotten me fired in Alindos. But here in the Iron Grave, it was a masterpiece of desperation. I could feel the heat radiating from Zane's body, the fever of a rejection that was fighting me every step of the way. I injected a dose of synthesized antibiotics, stuff I'd been saving for a rainy day, and watched as the inflammation began to recede. The mechanical arm, once a heavy, dead weight, suddenly hummed as the new sensors synced with her nervous system. One of the servos clicked, the fingers of the metal hand twitching in a rhythmic, 5-fingered salute. There, I whispered, leaning back and wiping the sweat from my brow with a grimy sleeve. The channel is clear. Kira lowered the light, her shoulders sagging as the adrenaline finally began to drain from her system. She looked at Zane, then at me. "You really are an engineer." "I'm a man with a set of tools and too much time on his hands," I said, stood up and stretched my aching back. The clock on the wall said it was 3 in the morning. I had been on my feet for nearly 20 hours. I walked over to the cooling unit and pulled out a bottle of filtered water, taking a long, deep swallow before offering it to Kira. She took it, her fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. Her hand was calloused, rough as sandpaper, but her grip was steady. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "You could have left us in the airlock. You could have called the corporate authorities and claimed the bounty on us. Ethelgard pays 100,000 marks for a recovered Gamma Series asset." I looked around my workshop, the rusted walls, the piles of scrap, the solitary chair by the window. "I had 100,000 marks once," I said. "I had a title, a pension, and a view of the Alindo skyline that would make you weep. None of it kept me warm when the council decided I was a political liability. Bounties are for people who still believe in the system, Kira. I stopped believing in the system the day they burned my house down for refusing to poison a water supply." Kira looked at the water bottle, then at the sleeping form of her son in the corner. Eris was curled up on the rags, his small chest rising and falling in a deep, dreamless sleep. Sola had moved to sit beside him, her hand resting gently on his head, her eyes closed. "We've been running for 3 weeks, Kira said, her voice barely a whisper. "Since the riot at the Boulogne docks. We stole a transport, but the fuel cells were corrupted. We drifted for 10 days before the gravity well of this moon caught us. We thought we were coming here to die." "Nobody dies on my watch," I said, though it felt like a lie even as I spoke it. "Not today, anyway." I walked over to the corner and picked up the copper gear Eris had made for me. I held it up to the light, the delicate wiring reflecting the dim glow of the workshop. "Your son has a gift," I said. "He sees the logic in the chaos. Most kids his age are busy breaking things. He wants to know how they fit together." Kira watched the gear, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "He takes after his father. He was a technician in the vats. He didn't make it out of the fire." "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be," she replied, her eyes hardening again. "He died so we could run. He made his choice." "Choice," I repeated the word, tasting it. It was a rare commodity in this sector of the galaxy. Usually things just happen to you. Gravity, radiation, corporate greed. But sitting here in the middle of a junk pile, surrounded by 3 refugees and a child, I realized that I had made a choice too. I had chosen to open the door. The sound of the electromagnetic storm outside reached a crescendo, a high-pitched scream that rattled the very foundations of the iron grave. The station groaned, the metal plates shifting as the moon's crust settled. "The heat is going to be a problem," I said, looking at the power gauge on the wall. "The scrubbers are running at 80% capacity, and with 5 people breathing in here, we're going to run out of clean air by the end of the week unless I can bypass the primary regulator." "Then bypass it," Sola said, her voice coming from the shadows. "You have the tools, you have the knowledge, and now you have the hands to help you." I looked at Kyra, then at the sleeping Zane. The idea of help was as foreign to me as the concept of a vacation. I had been a one-man crew for so long that I'd forgotten how to delegate. But as I looked at the way Kira held herself, the military posture, the sharp, observant eyes, I realized that she wasn't just a refugee. She was a resource. "Can you use a plasma cutter?" I asked. Kira smirked, a jagged, dangerous expression that made her look like the warrior she was. "I can cut through a bulkhead in 45 seconds if the vents are clear." "Good, because we're going to need to strip the wiring from Sector 9 if we want to survive the next 48 hours. The corporate scouts might have missed this moon on their first pass, but they'll be back. They always come back for their property." "We aren't property anymore," Zane whispered. She was awake, her eyes unfocused, but her voice surprisingly strong. She was looking at her mechanical arm, the fingers curling and uncurling in a smooth, fluid motion. "It feels different," she said. "The static is gone." "It's called silence, Zane," I said, walking over to the med bench and checking her vitals. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start working." The 5th morning on the iron grave didn't arrive with a sunrise. It arrived with the smell of scorched metal and the sound of 5 people breathing in a space meant for one. As I sat at my workbench, watching Kira sharpen her knife and Eris play with a set of discarded bolts, I realized that the silence I had cherished for 3 years was gone. And strangely enough, the noise didn't bother me at all. I looked at the copper gear in my hand and then at the 5 plates I had set on the table for our morning meal. We were a broken circuit, a collection of mismatched parts salvaged from the wreckage of a cruel empire. But as the lights flickered and the station groaned around us, I knew that as long as we kept the power flowing, we were more than just assets. We were a family. And in the cold, dark void of the rim, that was the most dangerous choice of all. The 5th morning on the Iron Grave arrived with a heavy, claustrophobic pressure that had nothing to do with the moon's atmospheric density. It was the weight of 5 distinct heartbeats in a space designed for one man and his ghosts. My workshop, once a temple of solitary precision, now felt like a crowded barracks. The air was thick with the scent of recycled broth, scorched copper, and the salt of unwashed skin. I was 42 years old, and for 1,000 days I had been the sole arbiter of my own reality. Now I couldn't even walk to the cooling unit without tripping over a shade child or navigating around Kira's morning combat drills. "Check the seals, Vane," Kira barked as I passed her. She was in the middle of a low-gravity stretch, her muscles roping under her purple-gray skin like cables. "Don't want any void leaks catching us while we're zipped into our bunks." I stopped and looked at her, my hand hovering over the coffee dispenser. "First of all, the name is Kalen. Second, I've checked the seals every morning for 3 years. They aren't going to fail because you decided to move in." She stood up, her eyes narrowing. "Systems fail when they're stressed. 5 people breathing in a one-man bucket is stress. Don't be a gear jammer, Chief. We're all on the same circuit now." Gear jammer. It was street slang from the lower docks, a derogatory term for an engineer who was too slow to react during a crisis. I felt a flash of irritation, the old Alindo's pride stinging like a fresh burn. I ignored her and retreated to my workbench, where Zane was already sitting. Zane looked different today. The gray, sickly pallor of the previous night had faded, replaced by a dull, healthy sheen. She was holding her mechanical arm out, watching the fingers twitch in response to her thoughts. The new sensory weave I had installed was glowing a soft, electric blue where it met the flesh of her shoulder. "It's zippy," Zane said, her voice a quiet rasp. "No more feedback drag. I can feel the torque in the servos before they even engage." I sat down and picked up a diagnostic scanner. That's because I bypassed the corporate safety limiters. Ethelgard designs those links to give the user a millisecond of lag. It keeps the asset from feeling too much like the machine. It keeps you submissive. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "And you don't care if I'm submissive?" "I care if you can hold a plasma torch without shaking," I said, clicking the scanner on. "On this rock, if you can't pull your weight, you're just dead weight. And I've got enough of that already." I felt a presence at my elbow. Eris was standing there, his amber eyes fixed on the circuit boards scattered across the bench. He didn't speak, but he held out a small, perfectly clean filter he had found in the scrap heap. "Good find, kid," I muttered. "Go put it in the secondary scrubber in Sector 9. The mention of Sector 9 brought the conversation back to the reality of our situation. The Iron Grave was a dying moon, and we were currently overloading its life support systems. The CO2 levels were creeping up, a slow, invisible poison that would turn us all into vegetables within 48 hours if I didn't fix the primary regulator. "I need to head into the deep tunnels," I announced to the room at large. "The regulator is buried in the substrata, 3 levels below the primary core. It's a 2-man job." "I'll go," Kira said, reaching for her tactical vest. "No," I said, looking at Zane. "I need a tech. Kira, you stay here and keep the perimeter hot. If a corporate scout drone pings this sector, I need someone who knows how to use a kinetic rifle." Kira looked like she wanted to argue, but Sola spoke up from her corner. "The engineer is right, daughter. The warrior guards the gate. The builder repairs the hearth. Go, Kalen. Take the girl. She needs to know the shape of the cage she is living in." I grabbed my heavy-duty toolkit and a pair of oxygen masks. Zane stood up, her mechanical arm whirring softly as it recalibrated. We didn't say goodbye. In the rim, goodbyes were considered bad luck. a way of inviting the void to fill the space you left behind. The walk to the substrata was a journey through a metallic nightmare. The walls were weeping frozen condensation, and the emergency lights were spaced 50 meters apart, leaving long stretches of absolute darkness in between. Zane followed me in silence, her footsteps lighter than mine. "Is it always this ghosted down here?" she asked, her voice echoing off the rusted bulkheads. "Always," I said. "This was a Nexara mining moon. When the veins ran dry 20 years ago, they just flipped the switches and left. They didn't even bother to vent the atmosphere. They just walked away. Like Olindos." I stopped, my mag light illuminating a patch of frost on the floor. "What do you know about Olindos?" "Kira says you were a big shot there," Zane said. "A chief engineer with a pension and a view. She says you got ghosted because you wouldn't play ball with the High Council." "Kira talks too much," I said, turning and continuing down the stairs. "I wasn't a hero, Zane. I was just a man who realized that the math didn't add up. They wanted me to sign off on a life support system for the lower ward that was designed to fail after 6 months. It was a cost-cutting measure disguised as an upgrade. And you said no. I said no. And 3 days later, my workshop was an ash pit and my citizenship was revoked. That's the problem with being an engineer in a world run by politicians. The truth is in the numbers, but the power is in the lies." We reached the regulator room, a massive cavernous space filled with the groan of ancient machinery. The primary regulator was a beast of a machine, a 10-meter-tall cylinder of brass and steel that looked more like an engine of war than a life support unit. It was vibrating violently, a low-frequency hum that I could feel in the marrow of my bones. "The intake valve is jammed," I said, pointing to a heavy iron plate near the base. "I need you to climb up to the secondary bypass and hold the manual release while I pry the plate open." Zane didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the ladder with a grace that made my 42-year-old knees ache with jealousy. She reached the bypass and hooked her mechanical arm into the release lever. "Ready, Chief," she called out. I jammed a crowbar into the seam of the intake valve and threw my entire weight against it. The metal groaned, a sound of pure mechanical agony. "Come on, you rusted piece of void spawn," I growled. The plate gave way with a thunderous crack, a cloud of black, oily steam erupting from the vent. I fell backward, the crowbar clattering across the floor. Zane let out a sharp cry as the bypass lever slammed shut, pinning her mechanical hand against the frame. "Zane!" I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering. "I'm okay," she shouted, though her voice was tight with pain. "The link is taking the pressure. Just get the valve turned." I grabbed the manual override wheel and began to spin it. It felt like trying to turn a mountain. Every rotation was a battle against 2 decades of rust and neglect. My muscles burned, and my lungs felt like they were filled with glass. I thought about the 4 people waiting for me in the upper decks. I thought about Eris and his copper gears. I thought about the 5 plates on the table. For 3 years I had survived for myself, and it had been easy. Living for yourself is a simple equation. Minimum input, maximum preservation. But this was hard. This was the burden of choice. With a final, desperate heave, the wheel clicked into place. The violent vibration of the regulator smoothed out into a deep, healthy thrum. The air in the room suddenly felt cooler, fresher. Zane pulled her hand free and slid down the ladder, landing beside me. Her mechanical fingers were dented, the blue light of the sensors flickering. "That was zesty," she said, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "You okay?" I asked, checking the damage to her arm. "It'll buff out," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "I've had worse from a standard shift at the docks." We sat there for a moment in the dark, the steady heartbeat of the regulator the only sound in the room. It was a victory, a small one, but it felt more significant than any of the multi-million credit projects I had overseen in Olindos. We had kept the air flowing. We had kept the circuit closed, but as we began the long walk back to the surface, the feeling of triumph began to fade. I looked at Zane, a girl who was more machine than human, living in a galaxy that considered her a piece of hardware. I looked at my own hands, scarred and grease-stained. We were fixing the station, but we couldn't fix the world outside. The Ethelgard Corporation was still out there. The High Council was still out there. and the iron grave was a very small place to hide from a very large fire. "You think we're going to make it, Vane?" Zane asked as we reached the airlock of Sector 4B. "I don't know, Zane," I said honestly, "but I do know one thing. The air is clean tonight, and that's a start." When we entered the workshop, the scene was one of domestic chaos. Kira was showing Eris how to field strip a kinetic pistol, and Sola was humming a low, tuneless song as she stirred a pot of synthetic stew. They looked up as we entered, the tension in the room visible for a split second before it dissolved into relief. "It's done," I said, dropping my toolkit on the floor. "CO2 levels are dropping. We can breathe for another week." "Good," Kira said, her eyes meeting mine, "because we're going to need every breath we can get." She gestured toward the primary monitor on the wall. A small, pulsing red dot had appeared on the edge of the long-range sensor grid. It was moving fast, cutting through the electromagnetic interference of the moon's storms with a surgical precision. "What is it?" I asked, my blood running cold. "Ethelgard scout ship," Kira said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "They found the pinger we left at the drop site. They're 30 minutes out from a standard orbital insertion. The turning point had arrived. The silence was over. The iron grave was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. And as I looked at the 5 people in the room, I realized that the choice I had made 4 days ago was about to be tested in a way that had nothing to do with engineering. 30 minutes. In Alindos, 30 minutes was the length of a standard lunch break. On the iron grave, it was the countdown to an extinction event. The workshop, which had felt like a home only an hour ago, was suddenly a cage again. The air was still clean, thanks to our work in the substrata, but it was charged with the static electricity of impending violence. Kira was a whirlwind of motion, checking the charge on her kinetic rifle and barking orders at Zane, who was busy fortifying the primary airlock with scrap metal. "We need to bug out, Vane," Kira said, slamming a fresh power cell into her weapon. "The transport we came in is ghosted, but we can make it to the escape pods in Sector 12. "Sector 12 is a vacuum, Kira," I said, leaning over the sensor console. "Those pods haven't been serviced in 20 years. If you launch in one of those, you're just putting yourselves in a smaller, more expensive coffin." "Then we fight here," she snapped. "This station has a defensive grid, doesn't it?" "It had one," I countered, "but the turrets are seized and the targeting computer is a brick. Even if I could get them online, we're talking about an Ethelgard prowler. It has more Ho-Luke than this entire moon." I looked at the monitor. The red dot was closer now. 25 minutes. Eris was standing by my elbow, his small face pale. "Will the men with the needles come?" he whispered. I looked down at him, and for the first time I didn't see an asset or a biohybrid. I saw a child who was terrified of the dark. I saw myself 30 years ago, watching the Nexera recruiters take my father away. "No," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "They aren't coming for you, Eris. Not today." I turned back to the console, my fingers flying over the keys. There had to be a way. An engineer's mind doesn't accept a zero-sum game. There is always a variable that can be manipulated. There is always a flaw in the system. "Sola," I said, looking over at the elder, "you said you can hear everything. Can you hear the scout ship?" The blind woman closed her eyes, her head tilting to the side. "I hear their heartbeat," she said, "a high-frequency pulse. It is rhythmic, arrogant. They are not searching, they are sweeping. They believe they already own the space they occupy." "A sweep," I muttered. "That means they're using active lidar. If I can't hide the station, maybe I can make it look like something else." "Eris, I need your help," I said, gesturing for the boy to come closer. "You remember the frequency ghost we found in the comms array yesterday? The one that looked like static but had a pattern?" The boy nodded. "It sounded like singing." "That wasn't singing, kid. That was the electromagnetic echo of the moon's core. If we can amplify that signal and broadcast it through the station's outer hull, we can create a cloaking field. Not a visual one, but a sensory one. To their LiDAR will look like a natural geological formation. Just another mountain of iron and rock." "Can you do that in 20 minutes?" Kira asked, her rifle held tight against her chest. "Not alone," I said. "Zane, I need you to go to the auxiliary antenna on the roof. You'll need to bypass the safety relays manually. Kira, you go with her. The wind is picking up and the radiation levels are going to be spicy. If she slips, you catch her. And what will you do? Kira asked. I'll be here riding the frequency, I said. If the signal drifts by even a fraction of a megahertz, the cloak will collapse and they'll see us clear as a day star. Kira looked at me, a long, searching gaze that seemed to weigh my soul. You're putting your life in our hands, Vane. No, Kira, I said. I'm putting our lives in our hands. Now move. Now. They scrambled out of the workshop, headed for the maintenance hatch that led to the lunar surface. Sola remained in her corner, her presence a calming anchor in the storm of activity. Eris stayed by my side, his small fingers resting on the edge of the console. What do I do, Kalen? He asked. You listen, I said, handing him a pair of headphones. When you hear the singing start to crackle, you tell me. Your ears are better than mine, Aris. You can hear the static before the computer can even see it. The next 15 minutes were a blur of tension and technical acrobatics. I could hear Zane and Kira over the comms link, their voices distorted by the interference of the storm. We're at the antenna, Zane shouted. The relay is frozen. I'm going to have to use the plasma cutter to melt the ice. Careful, Zane. Kira's voice was barely audible over the howl of the wind. The scout ship is entering the upper atmosphere. I can see their heat signature. I watched the sensor grid. The red dot was now a looming presence on the edge of the station's immediate perimeter. 19 minutes. 18. I began to feed the signal from the moon's core into the station's broadcasting array. The workshop filled with a low, vibrating hum that made the tools on my workbench rattle. The frequency ghost was a wild, unpredictable thing, a chaotic mess of electromagnetic energy that fought against the constraints of the transmitter. It's crackling, Eris shouted, pressing the headphones to his ears. It's starting to sound like broken glass. I adjusted the gain, my hands shaking. Come on, Eris, stay with it. On the monitor, the station's signature began to blur. The sharp, defined edges of Sector 4B dissolved into a messy cloud of interference. We were disappearing. Zane, the relay! I shouted into the comms. It's open, she screamed. I'm bypassing the safety now. A sudden surge of power slammed through the station's grid. The lights in the workshop flickered and died, replaced by the dim, red glow of the emergency backups. The hum of the frequency ghost intensified, becoming a physical weight that pressed against my chest. They're here, Sola said, her voice a calm whisper in the dark. I looked at the monitor. The Ethelgard prowler was directly above us. It was a sleek black predator, its hull covered in advanced sensor arrays that were currently bathing the moon's surface in high-intensity lighter pulses. The red dot stopped moving. It hovered directly over Sector 4B. I held my breath, my finger hovering over the frequency adjustment dial. The silence in the workshop was absolute. Even Eris was still, his eyes wide as he watched the monitor. The prowler began to descend. It was searching. It was looking for the asset it had lost. It was looking for the ghost of an engineer who had dared to say no. It's too loud, Eris whispered, his face twisted in pain. The singing, it's screaming now. I saw the signal begin to drift. The cloaking field was losing its cohesion. On the monitor, a small corner of the station's silhouette began to flicker into view. If they saw even a fraction of a bulkhead, it was over. They would target the breach and vent the entire sector before we could even scream. I closed my eyes and reached for the dial. I didn't look at the computer. I didn't look at the numbers. I listened. I listened to the sound of the moon, the deep, ancient vibration of the iron grave. I searched for the rhythm, the steady heartbeat underneath the chaos. I found it. I twisted the dial, matching the frequency not with logic, but with a sudden, intuitive certainty. The screaming in Eris's headphones smoothed out into a low, resonant thrum. On the monitor, the station's signature vanished completely. We were a mountain again. The prowler hovered for another 5 minutes. The longest 5 minutes of my life. I could imagine the corporate pilots in their high-tech cockpit, swearing at their sensors, wondering why the pinger had led them to a pile of dead rock. Finally, the scout ship began to rise. It turned, its thrusters kicking up a massive cloud of lunar dust, and accelerated toward the upper atmosphere. They're gone, I whispered, my legs finally giving out as I sank into my chair. Eris pulled off the headphones and looked at me, his eyes wide with wonder. We hid, Kalen. We hid from the fire. Yeah, kid, I said, wiping a hand across my face. We hid. Kira and Zane returned a few minutes later, their flight suits covered in frost, their faces pale from the cold. They didn't say anything as they entered the workshop. They just looked at me, then at the monitor, then at each other. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. We had survived the first pass, but we all knew that it was only a temporary reprieve. Ethelgard wouldn't stop at one scout ship. They would be back with a full recovery team. You did it, Vane, Kira said, her voice quiet as she set her rifle down. You actually did it. We did it, I corrected her. If Zane hadn't opened that relay, the signal would have fried the transmitter in 10 seconds. And if you hadn't been there to catch her? I trailed off, looking at the 5 people in the room. We were still a broken circuit, a collection of fugitives on a dead moon. But for the first time, the we didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a shield. But the cost of our victory was already visible. The station's power grid was severely damaged from the frequency surge. The life support systems were running on emergency reserves. We had hidden from the enemy, but in doing so, we had brought ourselves one step closer to a slow death by cold and dark. The lesson was clear, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet. Isolation was a safe bet, but survival required a team. And a team required trust, a commodity that was in even shorter supply than oxygen on the Iron Grave. We need to talk about what comes next, Sola said. Her milky eyes turned toward the empty space in the center of the room. The fire has seen us. It may have moved on for now, but the heat remains. I looked at the copper gear on my workbench and then at the 5 plates on the table. The turning point had passed. The choice had been made. Now we just had to figure out how to live with it. What do we do now, Chief? Zane asked, her mechanical arm whirring as she reached for a piece of bread. I looked at her, and then at Kira, and then at Eris. Now, I said, my voice steady. Now we stop hiding, and we start fighting back. But as I said the words, a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. A family is a choice, Kalen, but every choice has a price. And on the Iron Grave, the price of family was usually blood. I looked out the porthole at the cold, indifferent stars. The scout ship was gone, but the darkness was still there, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was the engineer or the machine. The Iron Grave was crying. That was the only way to describe the sound of a 5,000-ton mining station trying to hold itself together after a massive electromagnetic surge. The bulkheads groaned with a metallic sorrow, and the pipes shuddered as if they were catching their breath. We had successfully ghosted the Ethelgard scout ship, but the cost was etched into the glowing red warning lights of every console in the sector. We were operating on 3 out of 10 primary power cells, and the oxygen scrubbers were wheezing like an old man after a 20-kilometer hike. I stood at my workbench, my hands buried in the guts of a diagnostic unit. My fingers were steady, but my mind was a chaotic mess of variables and worst-case scenarios. Behind me, the workshop had transformed. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was a living room, a nursery, and a hospital ward all rolled into one. Sola was sitting by the auxiliary heater, her hands moving in the air, as if she were weaving invisible threads, whispering stories of the old sons to Aris. The boy was mesmerized, his amber eyes reflecting the dim orange glow of the heating coils. Kira was across the room, pacing like a caged predator. She had cleaned her kinetic rifle 4 times in the last 2 hours. She was a woman built for action, for the sharp, jagged moments of a fight, and the slow, grinding weight of a station failure was eating her alive. We can't sit here and wait for the air to go sour, Vane, she said, her voice a low vibration that matched the groan of the bulkheads. We have to bug out. Sector 12 is a risk, but it's better than being canned in a dead moon. I didn't look up. Sector 12 is a suicide note, Kira. I told you that. Even if we could get the pods to cycle, the life support on those things is probably rusted through. You'd be lucky to make it 20 minutes into the void before the seals popped. Then what? She snapped, stopping her pacing and slamming her hand against a crate. We stay here and wait for the next prowler to find us? They aren't stupid. They'll report the sensory anomaly, And next time they'll send a full recovery squad with ground sensors. We're sitting ducks in a metal pond. I finally set my tools down and turned to face her. My back ached and my eyes felt like someone had rubbed them with lunar dust. You're talking about survival, Kira. I'm talking about living. There's a difference. Is there? She hissed, stepping into my light. Because where I come from, survival is the only thing that matters. You don't get the luxury of living when your skin is property. The room went quiet. Even Sola's whispering stopped. Eris looked up, his face pale and uncertain. This was the friction point, the place where my world of engineering and logic collided with her world of trauma and blood. I looked at her, seeing the scars on her neck where the corporate collars had once sat, and the way her hands never quite stopped shaking until she was holding a weapon. Kira, I said softly, for 42 years I lived by the numbers. I thought if I just did the math right, I'd be safe. I thought if I stayed alone, I couldn't be hurt. I was wrong. The math didn't save me in Alindos, and the silence didn't make me happy. I gestured to the room, to Zane resting on the med bench, to Sola, and to the boy. This isn't just a junk pile anymore. It's the only place in the galaxy where you aren't an asset. If we run, we lose that. If we stay and fix this rock, we have a home. A home, she repeated, the words sounding foreign and dangerous in her mouth. I turned to Eris. Eris, come here. The boy hesitated, then slid off his crate and walked over to the workbench. I picked up a small, damaged sensor relay, a delicate thing made of silver wire and crystalline processors. Hold this, I said. He took it in his small hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. This is a neural relay, I told him. It's what allows the machine to feel the world around it. It's broken right now. The connections are frayed, and the static is blocking the signal. Most people would just throw it away and get a new one. But we don't have new ones. So what do? We fix it, Eris whispered. Right. But to fix it, you have to understand that the wires aren't just wires. They're a conversation. You have to listen to where the break is, and you have to choose to bridge the gap. I picked up a soldering iron and handed him a spool of high-grade wire. Show me how you'd bridge it. I watched as the boy worked. His fingers were precise, his focus so intense that he didn't even notice Kira watching him. He didn't just solder the wire, he wove it, mimicking the patterns he had seen me use. He was learning the language of the machine, but he was also learning something else, that his hands could create order out of chaos. Kira watched him for a long time, the tension in her shoulders slowly beginning to dissipate. She wasn't an engineer, but she understood the gravity of the moment. She saw her son, a child who had been designed to be a tool, choosing to be a creator. It's a zesty bridge, Zane said from the med bench, her voice stronger than it had been. She was sitting up, her mechanical arm resting on her knee. A bit messy on the edges, but the conductivity is 98%. Not bad for a sprout. Sprout. It was the slang the dock workers used for the young trainees. Eris beamed at the compliment, a rare bright flash of pride on his face. I looked at Kira. Choice, Kira. That's the only thing that matters. We choose to stay. We choose to be a family. And we choose to fight for this rock because it's ours. Kira looked at the boy, then at me. Her eyes were still guarded, still filled with the echoes of 1,000 battles, but the sharp, jagged edge of her anger had softened into something else. Something that looked a lot like hope. Fine, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We stay. But if we're staying, we're turning this station into a fortress. I'm not letting those glowworms take my son back to a vat. Glowworms, the street name for the corporate security forces in their high-visibility armor. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. That's the spirit. Zane, if you're mobile, I need you to help me with the secondary power grid. We're going to need to reroute every spare watt into the defensive turrets. Kira, you take Eris. Show him the layout of the ventilation shafts. If we get boarded, I want him to know every hidey hole in this sector. And me? Sola asked, her sightless eyes turning toward me. You, Sola, are the most important part of the circuit, I said. You listen. You tell us when the wind changes. You tell us when the darkness starts to move. The next 3 days were a blur of synchronized effort. We stopped being a collection of refugees and started being a unit. We worked in 20-hour shifts, sleeping in 4-hour rotations. We salvaged wire from the abandoned quarters, stripped metal from the dead sections of the station, and jury-rigged a power grid that would have made the Nexara inspectors have a collective heart attack. I taught Eris the basics of cortex linking, not the corporate way, where the machine controls the person, but the way I had learned in the underground workshops of Alindos. I showed him how to sync his pulse with the station's heartbeat, how to feel the vibration of the turbines in his teeth. He was a natural. He didn't just learn, he absorbed. He was the bridge between the biological and the mechanical, a perfect fusion of spirit and steel. But as the station began to hum with a new defensive energy, the cost of our choice became apparent. My hands were constantly bleeding from the sharp edges of the scrap metal. Zane's arm ached from the constant strain of the repairs. Kira was exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. We were transforming. We were becoming part of the iron grave, and it was becoming part of us. It was a painful, grinding process, like a gear being forced into a new slot. But it was ours. On the fourth evening, we sat around the table in the workshop. 5 plates, 5 hearts, 1 purpose. The air was cool and crisp. The regulators hummed with a steady confidence. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I looked at the copper gear Eris had made me. It was sitting in the center of the table, a small, shining symbol of what we had built. "We're ready," I said, looking around at my family. "Ready for what?" Eris asked. "Eris, ready for whatever the stars throw at us," I said. The answer came sooner than we expected. At precisely 2300 hours, the long-range scanners didn't just ping, they screamed. A massive gravitational shadow had appeared on the edge of the moon's orbit. It wasn't a scout ship, it wasn't a prowler, it was a retriever. Ethelgard's elite recovery vessel, a specialized hunter-killer designed for one task, to bring back stolen assets, dead or alive. The silence was over. The fight for the Iron Grave had begun. And as I looked at the 5 people around me, I knew that the choice we had made was about to be paid for in blood. The retriever didn't land. It didn't need to. It hung in the high orbit like a black, jagged shard of obsidian, its presence alone enough to cause the moon's fragile crust to shudder. It was a 100-meter-long nightmare of sensors and Hoaluk, a predator that had spent decades hunting the dregs of the galaxy. Within minutes of its arrival, a swarm of drop pods had streaked across the sky, landing in a tight perimeter around Sector 4B. They weren't using LiDAR this time. They knew exactly where we were. "They're hard locked on us, Vane," Kira shouted, checking the charge on her kinetic rifle. "The external sensors are picking up 20 thermal signatures. They're moving in a tactical wedge. Professional-grade solder heads. Solder heads. The slang for corporate mercenaries who had more cybernetic enhancements than original flesh. They were the elite, the men and women who had sold their humanity for a higher combat rating. "We're not venting today," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Zane, get the defensive turrets online. Kira, take the high ground on the catwalks. Sola, take Eris to the substrata. Stay near the regulator. If they breach the workshop, I want you deep enough that they'll have to dig for you." "I want to help," Eris said, his small fist clenched at his sides. "You are helping, Eris," I said, kneeling down so I was eye level with him. "I need you to listen to the station. If you feel the power grid start to fluctuate, you tell Sola. She'll know which relays to bypass. You're our backup, kid, the most important person in the room." The boy nodded, his amber eyes wide with a terrifying maturity. He took Sola's hand and led her toward the maintenance hatch. The blind woman stopped for a second, her head tilting toward me. "The hunter is not a machine, Kalen," she whispered. "He is a shadow with a heartbeat. Do not fight him with logic. Fight him with the fire you found in the vents." Then they were gone, vanishing into the darkness of the lower levels. Zane was at the tactical console, her mechanical arm plugged directly into the station's defensive grid. Her eyes were glazed over, her consciousness synced with the 3 automated turrets we had managed to revive. "I have a lock," she said, her voice sounding distant and metallic. "Turret 1 is tracking. Turret 2 is offline. The actuator is frozen. Turret 3 is at 50% power. Focus on the gap between the scrap heaps," I ordered. "Make them pay for every meter they cover." The first explosion rocked the station 3 minutes later. The outer airlock groaned as a shaped charge tore through the reinforced steel. The sound was a deafening roar that made the floor plates dance. "They're inside," Kira's voice crackled over the comms. "Catwalk 4. I've got 3 targets in the shadows. Opening fire." The workshop was suddenly filled with the staccato rhythm of kinetic fire. I could hear the sharp thwip-thwip of Kira's rifle, and the heavier, more resonant boom of the automated turrets engaging. The station was no longer a home, it was a meat grinder. I was at the primary power console, my fingers flying across the keys. I wasn't a soldier, but I was the engineer of this battlefield. I could control the doors, the lights, the air. I could turn the environment itself into a weapon. I vented the oxygen in Sector 7, trapping a 4-man squad in a vacuum. I saw their thermal signatures flare and then fade on the monitor. 4 lives ended in a second of mechanical coldness. I didn't feel the old Olindo's guilt. I didn't feel the math of the lives lost. I only felt the need to protect the circuit. "Vane!" Zane screamed. "Turret 3 is down. They used an EMP grenade. They're at the workshop door." I grabbed my heavy-duty welding torch and my kinetic pistol. I could hear the sound of the mercenaries at the door, the rhythmic, metallic thud of a breaching ram. "Kira, fall back to the workshop," I shouted. "I'm pinned, Vane. Too many of them. Go to the core. You have to dump the power." The core. If I dumped the primary power cells into the station's internal grid, it would create a massive electrical arc that would fry every cybernetic enhancement in the sector. It would kill the mercenaries instantly. But it would also reveal my location to the Ethelgard retriever. My unique engineering signature, the handwriting of my work, would be broadcast across the system. The corporation would know exactly who I was. The ghost of Kalen Vesper would be brought back to life, and I would spend the rest of my days in a high-security vat. It was the ultimate zero-sum game, my anonymity versus their lives. The door to the workshop exploded inward. A figure stepped through the smoke, a man who was more machine than human. He was nearly 2 meters tall, his body encased in matte black ceramic armor. His face was a mask of sensors and chrome, his eyes replaced by a glowing red visor. He was a retriever, a shadow with a heartbeat. "Kalen Vesper," the hunter said, his voice a synthesized rasp that sounded like metal grinding on bone. "You are a very difficult man to find." I didn't answer. I stood my ground, the welding torch in one hand, the pistol in the other. "The boy," the hunter said, his red visor scanning the room. "Where is the asset?" "Ethelgard wants its property returned, and it wants the traitor who hid it." "He's not an asset," I said, my voice shaking with a fury I hadn't felt in decades. "He's a person, and you're just a piece of hardware with a paycheck." The hunter raised a heavy-caliber kinetic rifle. "I am a solution," he said. "You are the problem." He fired. I dived behind my workbench, the kinetic rounds shredding the heavy oak and sending splinters of wood into my arm. I fired back, but the rounds bounced off his ceramic armor like pebbles off a tank. "Vane!" Kira's voice was a scream over the comms. "They're in the substrata. They've found the boy." The world went still. The sound of the gunfire, the groan of the station, the pounding of my own heart, it all faded into a single, terrifying clarity. Eris. The choice was no longer about anonymity. It was no longer about the math of my own survival. It was about the boy who had looked at me and seen a teacher. It was about the girl who had looked at me and seen a brother. It was about the blind woman who had looked at me and seen a man. Family is a choice. I reached for the primary power override, the red line switch I had installed 3 days ago. "Kalen, no." Sola's voice came over the comms, but it wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, a calm, steady presence in the chaos. "Do what you must, Builder. The fire is here." I looked at the hunter who was advancing toward my workbench, his red visor glowing with the certainty of victory. "I'm sorry, Olindos," I whispered, "but I found something better." I slammed the switch. The iron grave didn't just groan this time, it roared. A massive wave of electrical energy erupted from the primary core, surging through every floor plate, every bulkhead, and every wire in the station. It was a blinding, blue-white light that turned the workshop into a sun. The hunter screamed, a sound of electronic agony as his internal systems were fried by the overload. His ceramic armor began to smoke, the sensors in his visor exploding in a shower of sparks. He fell to his knees, his kinetic rifle clattering to the floor. Across the station, the mercenaries fell. The soldier heads, with their cybernetic hearts and neural bridges, were turned into expensive paperweights in a heartbeat. The light faded, leaving the workshop in absolute, terrifying darkness. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who had just revealed his soul to the universe. I sat on the floor, my hands shaking, my vision blurred. I could feel the silence of the moon returning, but it wasn't the lonely silence of 3 years ago. It was the silence of an aftermath. Vane. It was Eris. His voice came from the maintenance hatch, small and trembling. "I'm here, kid," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm right here." The boy ran out of the shadows and threw his arms around my neck. He was crying, but he was alive. Sola followed him, her milky eyes fixed on the spot where I sat. "You revealed yourself, Kalen," she said, her voice filled with a profound sadness and a fierce pride. "They know you are here." "I know," I said, looking at the hunter's lifeless body. "But they also know we aren't property." Kira and Zane emerged from the smoke, their faces blackened by soot, their bodies battered, but their eyes were bright. We had won. We had held the Iron Grave. But as I looked at the monitor, I saw the signal from the station's power dump, reaching out into the void, a beacon of light that would lead Ethelgard straight back to us. The hunt was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. I looked at the 5 people in the room. We were broken, we were exhausted, and we were the most wanted fugitives in the sector. But we were together. The transformation was complete. The solitary engineer was dead. In his place stood a man who had chosen a side. And as the stars watched from the dark void, I knew that the Iron Grave was no longer a graveyard. It was a home, and we would fight for it until the last scrubber failed and the air went cold. "Is this it, Kalen?" Eris asked, looking at the dead hunter. "Is the fire over?" "No, Eris," I said, pulling him close. "The fire is just beginning, but this time, we aren't the ones who are going to burn." I looked at Kira, who was already picking up the hunter's rifle, her eyes fixed on the orbit. "We're a circuit now," I said, "and we don't break." The night was long, and the stars were cold, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I had a choice. I had a family. And in the vast, empty reaches of the sci-fi universe, that was the only thing that was truly real. The silence that followed the power dump was unlike any I had ever experienced. It wasn't the peaceful, solitary silence I had cultivated for 3 years. This was a heavy, suffocating vacuum, the kind that follows a lightning strike when the air itself feels bruised and the ozone is so thick you can taste it on the back of your tongue. My workshop, once a place of ordered light and humming circuitry, was a tomb of shadows. The only light came from the dying embers of the hunter's internal processors, a faint, flickering red that pulsed like the heartbeat of a ghost. Eris was still clinging to my neck, his small body trembling with a rhythmic intensity. I could feel his heart hammering against my chest, a rapid-fire cadence that reminded me I was no longer a solitary machine. I was a tether. I reached up with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, numb, and trembling, and stroked his hair. "It's okay, Eris," I whispered, though my own voice sounded like it had been dragged through a kilometer of gravel. "The static is gone. We're still here." "Kalen?" It was Kyra. She was a silhouette in the doorway, her kinetic rifle hanging loose at her side. I could hear the wet, heavy sound of her breathing. She sounded like she had been running through a vacuum. "I'm here," I said. "We're all here." "Zane?" I called out into the dark. I'm upright." Zane's voice came from the tactical console. Her voice was thin, vibrating with the aftershocks of the neural surge. "That was zesty, Chief. Really, really zesty." I think I just saw the birth of the universe through my left eyeball. I felt a small, ragged laugh escape my throat. It was a hysterical, jagged sound that didn't belong in a graveyard. I gently set Eris down, my legs threatening to buckle as I stood up. I reached for my mag light, clicking it on. The beam sliced through the smoke, illuminating the carnage. The hunter lay in a heap near the workbench, his matte black armor scorched and pitted. Wisps of acrid smoke still rose from the seams of his visor. He was a multi-million credit piece of Ethelgard hardware, reduced to a pile of slag by a man with a soldering iron and a point to prove. Kira walked over to the body, her boots crunching on the glass shards of my shattered monitors. She looked at the dead mercenary for a long time, her face a mask of cold, hard calculation. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a woman who had just realized the war had changed its coordinates. "You dumped the signature, Kalen," she said, her voice flat. "You didn't just fry the solder heads, you lit a flare that the entire sector can see." "I know," I said, looking at the dead consoles. "I didn't have a choice, Kira." She turned to me, her amber eyes burning in the light of my torch. "You always have a choice, Vane. You chose to let them see you. You chose to stop being a ghost. Do you have any idea what that means? They won't just send another retriever. They'll send a fleet. They'll glass this moon just to make sure the records are clean." I walked over to the cooling unit, which was now silent and dead, and leaned against it. "I know what it means, Kira. It means I'm not invisible anymore. It means Kalen Vesper is back on the grid." "But why?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Why would you throw away 3 years of safety for a handful of assets that aren't even your own kind?" I looked at Eris, who was standing by the workbench, his small fingers tracing the edges of the copper gear he had made. He looked up at me, and in those amber eyes I saw a reflection of the man I used to be, and the man I was becoming. "Because they aren't assets, Kira," I said, "and they aren't strangers. They're the people who sat at my table. They're the people who helped me fix the air. They're the people who made me realize that living alone on a moon isn't survival. It's just a slow-motion funeral." Sola emerged from the maintenance hatch, her milky eyes turned toward the ceiling. She didn't need light to see the weight of the moment. She walked over to us, her hand reaching out to touch the cold, dead metal of the bulkheads. "The iron grave is silent now," she said. "The moon is holding its breath. But the echo of the light you created is already traveling. It is reaching out to the others, to the ones hiding in the drift, to the ones in the vats who dream of fire." She turned her head toward me, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "You didn't just save us, Builder. You gave the void a name, and the void is going to answer." "What are we going to do?" Zane asked, joining us in the center of the room. Her mechanical arm was sparking occasionally, a sign that the neural link was struggling to recalibrate. "We can't stay here. The life support is on its last legs and the power cells are fried." "We leave," I said. "We take the transport." Kira came in. "That ship is a bucket of bolts, Vane," Kira said. "The fuel cells are corrupted, and the navigation computer is a brick. It'll never make it past the high orbit." "Then we fix it," I said, my voice gaining strength. "We have a technician, an engineer, and a warrior, and we have the most motivated crew in the galaxy. We have 24 hours before the next Ethelgard ship enters the system. That's more than enough time for a group of scrappers like us to build a miracle. The next 20 hours were a blur of desperation and mechanical genius. We worked with a level of synchronization that defied logic. Zane and I were buried in the guts of the transport, our hands moving in a frantic, grease-stained dance. We bypassed the corrupted fuel cells by rerouting the power through the station's emergency batteries. We jury-rigged a navigation bridge using the processors from the dead hunter's armor. Kira worked on the hull, sealing the breaches with scrap metal and a plasma welder. She moved with a rhythmic efficiency, her movements stripped of the nervous tension that had defined her since she arrived. She wasn't just guarding us anymore, she was building our exit. Eris was everywhere, his small frame allowing him to reach the tight corners that Zane and I couldn't. He carried tools, held lights, and once, when a coolant line burst, he managed to plug the leak with his own hands until I could get a clamp on it. He didn't complain about the cold or the dark. He worked like a man 10 times his age, his face set in a grim, determined lines. Sola sat in the center of the transport, her eyes closed, her voice a low, steady hum. She wasn't helping with the repairs, but she was keeping the rhythm. She was the metronome for our labor, her presence a calming anchor that prevented the exhaustion from turning into panic. By the 22nd hour, the transport groaned as its engines sputtered to life. It was a jagged, uneven sound, like a beast waking up from a long, painful sleep. The interior lights flickered, a sickly green, but they stayed on. "It's holding," Zane whispered, her hand resting on the throttle. "It's actually holding." I climbed out of the engine bay, my flight suit soaked in hydraulic fluid and sweat. I looked at the 5 people in the hold. We were battered, we were filthy, and we were about to jump into a void that wanted us dead. But we were a unit. We were a closed circuit. "We need a name for her," Eris said, looking at the rusted bulkheads of the ship. "Every ship needs a name." I looked at Kira, who was wiping the grease from her forehead. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unburdened smile on her face. "How about the Vesper?" she suggested. I shook my head. "No, that's a name for a ghost. This ship is about the people who are on it." I looked at the copper gear sitting on the dashboard, the light reflecting off its hand-woven wires. "Let's call her the Echo," I said, "because we're the sound that refuses to fade away." "The Echo," Eris repeated, his eyes bright. "I like that." We began the pre-launch sequence. The station groaned around us, the final reserves of power being drained by the ship's engines. I felt a pang of sadness as I looked at the workshop one last time. It had been my sanctuary, my prison, and finally my forge. I was leaving behind the only safety I had ever known for a future that was as certain as a black hole. But as I took my seat at the pilot station and Eris climbed into the seat beside me, I realized that safety was a lie I had told myself to stay sane. True survival wasn't about the thickness of the hull or the quality of the oxygen. It was about the hands that held the controls. Kira took the co-pilot's seat, her hands resting steady on the tactical console. Zane was at the engineering station, her mechanical arm whirring with a new, confident purpose. Sola sat behind us, her presence a silent, watchful blessing. "Clear the docking clamps," I ordered. "Clamps cleared," Zane responded. "Initiate thrusters." "Initiate." The ship bucked as the thrusters flared. The iron grave began to recede, its jagged mountains and rusted spires disappearing into the darkness. We were moving. We were flying. As we cleared the moon's atmosphere, the long-range scanners pinged. 3 Ethelgard ships were entering the system, their signatures massive and predatory. They were looking for the scrapper on the moon. They were looking for the asset that had dared to run. But the Echo was already turning toward the drift, toward the chaotic, beautiful mess of the asteroid belts where a ship that knew its own frequency could hide forever. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Eris asked, looking at the red dots on the monitor. "Let them come," I said, my voice steady. "We aren't hiding anymore, Eris. We're living." And as the ship surged forward into the deep, dark void, I knew that the lesson of the Iron Grave was finally complete. A family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you built with your own hands, wire by wire, choice by choice. The fire was behind us, and the stars were ahead. And for the first time in 42 years, I knew exactly where I was going. The Echo moved through the deep space with a rhythmic, stuttering grace. Every 3 hours, the secondary power coupling would groan, requiring Zane to dive into the maintenance shaft with a plasma welder and a handful of prayers. Every 6 hours, the oxygen levels would dip, a reminder that we were 5 living souls breathing in a vessel designed for 3. But we didn't panic. We didn't turn on each other. We had learned the language of the struggle on the Iron Grave, and we carried it with us like a shared dialect. We had been in the drift for 10 days, navigating the chaotic fields of frozen rock and industrial debris that formed a barrier between the corporate core and the outer rim. It was a place of ghosts and shadows, a graveyard of forgotten ambitions, and it was the only home we had left. I was sitting at the navigation console, my fingers tracing the glowing lines of our flight path. We weren't just running, we were searching. Sola had given us coordinates, a series of harmonic frequencies that she claimed belonged to a hidden colony of liberated shades, a place called the Bastion. It sounded like a myth, a bedtime story for biohybrids. But in the void, myths were often the only maps worth following. "Kalen," I looked up. Eris was standing beside me, holding 2 nutrient bars and a cup of water. He was wearing a set of flight coveralls that Kira had cut down to fit him. He looked like a miniature version of the technicians I used to oversee in Olindos, but his eyes were far more ancient. "You need to fuel up," he said, echoing my own words from our first days in the vents. "You've been at the nav log for 6 hours." I took the food, my hands shaking slightly. "Thanks, kid. How's the engineering deck?" "Zane says the fuel cells are holding their breath," Eris reported, sitting on the edge of the co-pilot seat. "And Mama's teaching me how to read the thermal signatures of the asteroids. She says I have scout eyes." I smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the ship's heaters. "You do, Eris. You see the things most people ignore." He was quiet for a moment, looking out the reinforced viewport at the tumbling rocks of the drift. "Kaylin, do you miss your house? The one in the big city with the view?" I thought about Olindos. I thought about the white marble towers, the clean air, and the silent, sterile luxury of my life as a chief engineer. I thought about the hundreds of people I saw every day who never really looked at me. "I don't miss it, Eris," I said honestly. "I miss the tools sometimes. I miss having a forge that didn't spark every time I used it. But the view was a lie. It was a picture of a world that didn't care if I existed." I looked at him, at his amber eyes and his oil-stained hands. Here in the dark, with a broken ship and an uncertain future, I've never felt more visible. Eris nodded as if he understood perfectly. "I like the echo better than the dark box. It's noisy, but it's a good noise." He hopped off the seat and headed back toward the engineering deck, his small footsteps a rhythmic comfort in the silence of the bridge. I watched him go, and I felt a sudden, profound realization. I hadn't just saved a child, I had been saved by one. I stood up and walked to the small table in the corner of the bridge. It was a crude thing, made from a salvaged cargo pallet, but it was the center of our world. I picked up 5 metal plates and began to set them on the table. It was a ritual now. Every evening, no matter how low the power was or how close the corporate sensors were, we sat together. We shared what we had, we talked about the repairs, and we told stories. Kira emerged from the tactical bay, her face relaxed, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She walked over to the table and began to help me set the plates. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was a geometry to our movements, a shared understanding that had been forged in the fire of the Iron Grave. Zane and Sola followed, bringing a pot of rehydrated stew that smelled of synthetic sage and hope. We sat down, a circle of 5 souls in a universe of billions. "We're close," Sola said, her milky eyes fixed on a point beyond the hull. "The frequency is growing stronger. The bastion is waiting." "How do we know they'll take us in?" Zane asked, her mechanical arm whirring softly as she reached for a piece of bread. "I'm a broken tech, and Kalen is, well, he's a human." "They'll take us because we're a circuit," I said, looking around the table. "They'll take us because we've proven that the old rules don't apply." Kira reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her grip was rough, calloused, and absolute. "They'll take us because we're family," she said, "and because any colony would be lucky to have a gear jammer like you on their side." I laughed, the sound echoing through the bridge. Gear jammer. I think I'm going to have that etched onto my next flight suit. We ate in silence, the echo humming around us. I looked at the people at the table. The warrior who had found her peace, the tech who had found her strength, the elder who had found her legacy, and the boy who had found his name. I looked at my own hands. They were scarred, grease-stained, and old, but they were the hands of a man who had built something that wouldn't break. After dinner, the others retired to their bunks, leaving me alone on the bridge. I sat in the pilot's seat, watching the stars move past the viewport. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in 42 years. It wasn't the peace of safety, it was the peace of purpose. I spent 42 years building walls. In Olindos, I built them out of marble and high-grade shielding, thinking that if I just made the barriers thick enough, the world's rot wouldn't touch me. On the Iron Grave, I built them out of silence and scrap metal, convincing myself that invisibility was the ultimate armor. I lived like an island, a solitary circuit with no input and no output, convinced that the only way to avoid being broken was to never be connected. I was a man who understood the physics of structural integrity, but knew nothing about the gravity of a human heart. I thought that saving myself was the highest form of engineering. But then I found a child in a vent, and the walls started to crumble. I realized that a wall isn't a sanctuary, it's a tomb with better ventilation. I learned that the most resilient structures in the galaxy aren't made of steel or stone, but of the invisible threads of trust and the stubborn choice to stand by someone who has nothing to give you back but their breath. I am no longer the man who hides in the shadows. I am the man who lights the flare. My name is Kalen Vesper, and for the first time in my life, I am not just a component in someone else's machine. I am a part of a circle, and a circle, once closed, is the strongest shape in the universe. I lost my home to find my family, and I would make that trade 10,000 times over. Because in the end, we aren't defined by what we survive, but by who we survive for. I reached for the navigation controls and adjusted our heading. The frequency from the bastion was a steady, pulsing rhythm now, a heartbeat in the dark. I pushed the throttle forward, and the echo surged toward the light. I thought about the thousands of people still trapped in the vats, the thousands of engineers still building walls in Alindos, and the millions of souls drifting through the void, thinking they were alone. I wondered if they could hear us. I wondered if they knew that the darkness wasn't an ending, but a beginning. I have to ask you, as I look out at this vast, crowded, lonely galaxy, I spent 42 years thinking that being invisible was the only way to be safe, only to realize that being seen is the only way to be real. Is there someone in your life you have been hiding from, thinking that your walls are protecting you? What would it feel like to finally reach out, to open that airlock, and to choose a family that doesn't share your blood, but shares your fire? I reached out and touched the small copper gear sitting on the console. It was rough, lopsided, and perfect. I turned off the bridge lights and sat in the dark watching the stars. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a man, and I was going home. The echo disappeared into the nebula, leaving nothing behind but a lingering frequency that sounded a lot like music. I picked up the fifth plate from the table and stacked it neatly with the others, the metal clinking in the quiet ship. The circuit was closed, and for the first time, the light was staying on.